I call this.
Je déclare la séance ouverte. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 72 du Comité permanent des pêches et des océans de la Chambre des communes. La réunion se déroule dans un
2022. Before we proceed, I will need to remind everyone to address all comments through the chair. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on December 9, 2022, the committee is proceeding to a briefing on measures taken by DFO in response to recommendations tabled in the committee report entitled West Coast Fisheries, Sharing Risks and Benefits of the 42nd Parliament. Joining us today, we have officials from Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have on video conference Mr. Neil Davis, Regional Director of Fisheries Management Branch Pacific Region. Here in the room we have Jennifer Mooney, Director National Licensing Operations. And of course we also have Mr. Mark Waddell, Director General Fisheries Policy. Thank you all for taking the time to appear today. You have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. I don't know who's giving that statement.
Mr. Chair, that will be me.
Okay. When you're ready, 5 minutes or less, please.
Okay, thank you. Bonjour and good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. I'd just like to start today by acknowledging the ongoing extreme wildfire situation that is affecting many Canadians in several regions across the country, including Nova Scotia, Quebec, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. While the situation there is evolving, we know that the impact is far-reaching, and our thoughts are with those affected by these extreme events. My name is Neil Davis. I'm the Regional Director of Fisheries Management in Pacific Region, which includes BC and the Yukon. I'm honored to be appearing before you today with my colleagues, Mark Waddell, who is our Director General of Fisheries Policy, and Jennifer Mooney, our Director of National Licensing Operations. To begin, I'll acknowledge that I am joining you today from Vancouver, located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My colleagues and I appreciate the opportunity to provide the committee with information on our activities in response to recommendations in your 2019 report. The department understands the importance of fisheries to those who depend on the resource for their livelihoods. Our mandate commitments to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the Blue Economy, and the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative all relate to the importance of managing fisheries to prioritize conservation and sustainable use, comply with our legal obligations, such as ensuring Indigenous rights are upheld, and promoting the economic viability of commercial fisheries. As you heard in the 2019 hearings, fisheries management and related licensing policy evolved differently on the West Coast than on the East Coast, with a primary focus here on managing fisheries to ensure the conservation of fish stocks and on addressing the challenges posed by overcapacity in the fishing fleet. In 2020, the government issued a response to the committee's 2019 report. Among other things, the response acknowledged the minister's authority to consider social, economic, and cultural factors in decision-making, noted that the needs and rights of Indigenous harvesters must be respected, and stated that engagement must include a cross-section of interests to arrive at approaches that are tailored to the BC context. The 2019 report made recommendations for policy changes on matters that have significant implications for the livelihoods of fishers. We also know that fishery participants have diverse and strongly held views about some of these topics. Given this, DFO has planned and consulted on our work to date carefully. We have taken a staged approach to responding to the issues raised. There are a number of the committee's recommendations that DFO has already taken steps to implement, and there are others where DFO plans to undertake more in-depth engagement as part of broader consultations planned on reforms to commercial fisheries that can support socioeconomic objectives. Since 2020, the department has conducted early engagement with industry associations, some First Nations organizations, and fishery advisory boards to gather initial views and questions on the 2019 report. This has informed the department's steps in the past several years to respond to the issues the committee raised. I'll briefly summarize our work on specific recommendations here, and I'm happy to provide additional detail during this hearing. In 2021, we completed a comparative analysis of fisheries policies and regulations on the west and east coasts, which aimed to identify changes that could support independent commercial harvesters on the west coast. Last year, we completed an assessment of the technical requirements and feasibility of developing a public-facing license and quota registry. In February of 2022, the department launched the Beneficial Ownership Survey to identify the domestic and foreign entities who are benefiting directly or indirectly from commercial fishing licenses and quota. Work has been initiated to further strengthen socioeconomic information to support decision-making. This includes initiating new economic research and data collection through surveys to fill gaps. The first of these surveys launched in November 2022, with others getting underway this year. The department has also been working to make that socioeconomic data more accessible by developing new commercial and recreational fishery data dashboards. These are planned to come online this fall. DFO has also reviewed and updated its policy and terms of reference for commercial fishery advisory boards. We expect to implement the next stage of an engagement plan to further consult on the work we've done and on the related issues we are discussing here. We're committed to working with commercial fishery participants to better understand their perspectives on the current challenges and potential solutions. Thank you, and we look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you for that. We'll now proceed to our rounds of questioning, and I'd remind members to identify who the question has actually been targeted to. We'll start off with Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Davis and the others for being here and coming back to us to report on our report and your work on that report. Mr. Davis, how many of the recommendations in the 2019 report have been completed at this stage?
We have work underway on a number of the recommendations, as I was describing briefly in my opening comments, and then expect to be engaging on the balance, which we have done some work on a number of those as well through engagement that we expect to get underway in the months ahead.
Okay, thank you. What would you say are the results of the assessment of the technical requirements of achieving this? How much more needs to be done, and if you've achieved anything on that, what would it be?
Yeah, so very, very good question. I would say that what we really set out to do with that assessment is first to sort of look at our existing systems and assess what would it take to draw those systems into a public-facing registry. So I think what we learned out of that first step is that we think we can do that. It's technically feasible. And we got some proposals or some direction on what it would take to do that. The pieces that I think we have some outstanding questions
before you move on to another, and you can before you move on to the next piece, how long is it going to take you to move that information system?
To develop such a system, I don't know that we yet have an estimate of that. What we're working on right now is to develop the contract that we would be seeking someone to develop the system, and I expect that part of the response to a request for proposals would be information provided by bidders about how long it would take them to develop what we're looking for.
Okay, thank you. In your opening statements, you mentioned that changes to the terms of reference of the commercial fisheries advisory boards. Can you tell us what those changes have been?
So we have had a little bit of conversation with advisors in commercial fisheries advisory processes now to inform a review of the way we have terms of reference developed now, which can vary from one committee to the next for each fishery. Out of that, we've drafted some revisions to what would be a terms of reference and some guidance for how we would develop terms of reference for each individual fishery. And that's something we expect to be engaging stakeholders on as part of this broader engagement that we do. So I don't have the specific changes in front of me, but the idea would be to take that out and see what kind of feedback we get to arrive at something we think is going to be workable and that reflects the interests and some of the recommendations that this committee made in terms of making those committees or those advisory boards more inclusive.
I would say that's different than what was in your opening statements that were provided to us. It said DFO has also reviewed and updated its policy and terms of reference for commercial fisheries advisory boards. But what I got from you just now was that more like you're looking at those reviews. So in other words, you're planning to plan similar to the integrated fisheries management plans that haven't been developed, that were promised back in the 90s, where the department's response was to develop a plan to develop those plans. Would you say that that's any different than what's happening here? Is you're developing terms of reference to develop terms of reference?
No, but thank you for the chance to clarify. So we have reviewed and updated our policy and terms of reference for commercial advisory bodies, but we view them as drafts because we would like to take those revised versions out for consultation before we finalize them.
Thank you. Probably only time for one more question, but could you provide the committee with a table showing the status of government responses to the 2019 recommendations and timelines, dates for the ongoing actions?
Yes, we certainly can do that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm almost out of time. Is this issue a priority for the minister?
I think that's a better question for the minister than for me. We've made commitments in the government's response to the 2019 recommendations that include a commitment to further engagement around the issues that were raised, and we intend to follow through with that.
Okay, thank you. I was looking at my timer wrong. Thought I had 5 minutes. I have 6. Why is it that so little has been achieved on this when the problem really has been around for much longer than the report, from when the report came out in 2019? Obviously, it was a known issue prior to that report. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been brought to this committee to do a study on. Why would you say that so little has been achieved on this issue when so many lives and so much revenue is at risk?
I don't know that I would share the view that so little has been done. I think we knew from the outset that the committee's recommendations were very wide-ranging and addressed a number of very complex topics on which participants in the commercial fishery have a real diversity of views. And so from the outset, we knew we would take a staged approach to how we responded to the issues the committee raised, picked things that we knew we could advance and get moving on immediately, while we sort of, reached out and did some initial engagement to start gathering views and developing a bit of a plan for how we would engage in more depth on those topics that we do see as more foundational and where, in order to address or initiate some of the changes the committee had recommended, we would need to be thinking very carefully through the implications of change and how we would get through that process.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold.
Thank you.
Thinking you had 5 minutes, you almost went to 7. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less, please.
Or close to 7, perhaps. Who knows? Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here. The West Coast has certainly been invested in the outcomes of that 2019 report. There were sessions in early 2020 in Nanaimo and then another one earlier this year in Victoria. And Mr. Davis, you attended that and presented some information. I think that was very valuable. Were you able to stay in that session long enough to see how the attendees rated or prioritized the recommendations in the 2019 report?
I was not.
Okay. Are you aware of how they have prioritized the things that they would like to see action on sooner rather than later? No is a good answer.
I don't think so.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Well, we'll certainly pass those along because I think that that will help inform where resources are sent. And I'm going to go through some of those priorities, in questioning now and hopefully a little bit later. My colleagues have threatened to be very generous in terms of donating their time. You mentioned it. It's been mentioned before that the recommendations are broad, and some of them really do involve massive changes. I've heard that you and perhaps one other person have been tasked over time with responding to this report. And I guess a fair question is to say, has the DFO actually allocated the resources? Do they have the resources to move these recommendations forward expeditiously?
Thank you for the question. So if you'll permit me, I'll maybe address that in two parts. The first is what it would take to, sort of do the consultation and undertake work on any potential changes. And the second is the implementation phase. With respect to, the engagement and the development of any proposals for change, yes, we have staff that are dedicated to this file. But more importantly,
I'm sorry, sir, how many staff are dedicated to the file? Do you know?
So we have one person who is a manager that oversees this file, and they in turn have a staff person whose sole responsibilities relate to the work on this file. But if I could, because the recommendations are so broad, they will necessarily implicate all kinds of staff across a variety of our fisheries management groups and teams. And so I expect that as we move forward with this work, we'll also be drawing on parts of their time to understand, do the analysis and engage with their particular stakeholders, et cetera. So it will very much be a team effort to be successful in this regard. Part two, if I could, is of your question is more to do with the implementation. And I think depending on what comes out of the engagement process and what gets put forward in terms of recommendations for change and in turn approved, there certainly can be implications for the resources the department would require to implement any changes over time. And in that respect, I think we can learn from what other regions have done to address similar sort of objectives that the committee has been identifying here.
Thank you for that. One of the framing pieces that has come out very, very clearly since we tabled that report, and indeed during the witness testimony that informed the report, is the need to look beyond the economics to the socioeconomic or the social, cultural, and community building impacts. Is this new territory for the DFO? Because, certainly in the previous government prior to 2015, it seemed to be more about economics and managing fishing effort as a way to basically manage the fishery.
So I think it is fair to say, I will answer for my region, that in the context of Pacific region, conservation is the department's #1 priority. So that will always be the primary focus for us. In Pacific, I would say that focus has been paired with work that has also focused on sort of supporting the economic viability of fisheries. And this connects to what have been some of the the key or persistent challenges in Pacific fisheries, one of which being overcapacity. And so if you look at some of the changes that have been made to commercial fisheries management over the past several decades, they tend to address these two issues together of conservation or sustainability and how able we are to effectively manage the fishery with making changes to support the viability of those who participate in the fishery. With respect to the social and cultural, I think our primary focus in recent years has been in an Indigenous context in that regard, supporting the transition or shifting of fisheries access to First Nations to support their aspirations for participation in commercial fisheries, and recognizing the importance that fisheries have to many coastal communities and communities inland who are next to anadromous streams and rivers. So yes, in certain contexts, I think we have had programs and work that has focused on supporting those objectives. The way I understand the committee's interest is in sort of more broadly for the entirety of the commercial fishery. And I think in that respect, it has been less of a focus in this region.
Mr. Hardy, your 6 minutes is up. We'll now go on to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to our witnesses. It is much appreciated. I have many questions. We've heard from witnesses who have not wanted to reveal their identity, and that is a concern to the extent here that we're talking about food security, socioeconomic protection of communities, livelihoods, protection of resources, conservation. It all comes together. Are you not afraid that this is a race for time? The last study dates back 4 years. Is it not your impression that we should be sounding the alarm a little louder to raise the awareness of the department of the danger of losing our food sovereignty and being less in control of our fishery? That is that time is against us in this situation.
Thank you for the question. I maybe would offer two things in response. The first is that I think we've recognized a lot of the concerns raised and have been, I think, quite intentional in how we've tried to respond to them. And I may turn to my colleague Mark Waddell to speak more about the beneficial ownership survey in this regard. But the first, I think, thing we've done is really tried to gather information to validate or ground truth some of the assertions that have been made about where licenses and quota are going, to put ourselves in a better position to respond appropriately and assess what our policy options are. The second note I would just make before turning to Mr. Waddell for more anything he wants to add is that the minister does retain discretion over where licenses and quota are issued. And so, I think that is an important and powerful tool that remains at her discretion or at available to her at any point in time. And so, if out of this exercise there are issues identified that the department is asked to take action on, then I think we have the tools necessary to implement change. But maybe I'll turn it over to Mark Waddell to see if he has anything to add.
Thanks, Neil, and thank you for the question, Chair. I guess I'd sort of build on that in the fact that Neil's spot on. We have taken time to gain the evidentiary basis to understand what's actually transpiring on the water and get a better perspective on that, such that we can subsequently engage our fish harvesters, our license holders, and have an informed discussion. So certainly that's what we undertook with the beneficial ownership survey. We've heard of that previously at this committee a couple weeks ago, and I believe that's the testimony you're referencing, Madame Debienne. But very much look forward to those results going back out, as we anticipate that they will go out in the coming weeks, and we'll have an opportunity to engage with license holders on those and have that further informed discussion.
There's some 20% or a 20% response rate to the survey. Now, to what extent can you check that those who have not responded are those who have dealings with foreign ownership? Do you have a way of assessing this?
You're correct. At least in the Pacific region, we had a 79% response rate. That 79% comprises 88% of licenses, though. So there's a smaller delta. And then of the parties who did not respond, over 3/4 of them, 77%, hold but a single license. And what we did experience in the course of the survey is a number of license holders engaging the department to ask us as to whether or not they needed to be responding to the survey, recognizing that their fishery had been closed. So some of these license holders are not active. The fisheries have been closed or are under moratoria by the department. Ergo, license holders did not respond. So that is part of it, but we will be doing spot checks.
Est-ce qu'on peut penser?
Could one believe that the report going back 4 years will actually align with this report we'll be issuing? Will you be able to add up all of the knowledge and the recommendations we'll be making in a few weeks' time? Do you think you're going to have additional information or any additional directives that might help you activate things?
Êtes-vous ouvert à...
Are you open?
This committee would elect to provide in terms of recommendations and guidance, and look forward to receiving that. Ultimately, though, we are going to be in a much more informed position with the results of the beneficial ownership survey to have that discussion with license holders as to what they are experiencing on the water, and we look forward to pursuing that conversation with them.
Thank you, Madame Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. My first question, I believe, would be best suited for Mr. Waddell as it relates to the survey. Building off of my colleague, Madame Debienne's questions. Specifically, at the onset of this survey construction, Mr. Waddell, through the Chair, were you part of the development of this survey from the onset?
Yes, I was.
Great. Thank you. Can you clarify to the committee today if there were any concerns that were brought to your attention around the construction of the survey or the questions that were within the survey that were to go out?
So early on in the development of the survey, which we did in conjunction with the forensic auditors at PSBC, as well as through consultations with industry, Federation members, the Fisheries Council of Canada, and others, to gain perspective. What the intent of the survey was to gain as much possible information on beneficial ownership structures with the lightest administrative touch on respondents, recognizing that most of our respondents are not accountants, are not practiced or forensic experts. And one of the early things that was flagged was the leasing of quota, and that was an issue that was raised by Pacific Region colleagues from both FCC and Federation. And admittedly, we all came to the conclusion that this was going to be a very complex issue to ascertain through the survey, particularly in an attempt that was meant to have a lighter administrative touch on respondents. So we collectively elected to set it aside for the time being, recognizing that it would require additional work, and we still have a very keen interest in better understanding the licensing and leasing arrangements that are practiced in the Pacific Region.
Thank you. Based on that, do you have any concerns then that the responses received will be misleading?
So the way the survey was structured, while we will not drive to the nature of any lease arrangements in terms of the granular detail of how those are structured between the leasee and the lessor, we will have an acknowledgement as to whether that type of arrangement is in place. So we will have a count, in essence, of how many leasing arrangements there are in Pacific Region, and that'll allow us to better ascertain the scope of the issue. We also undertook a survey or a pilot project with EcoTrust for them to develop and articulate to us the typical corporate structures that are employed by Pacific Region. I think in their own work that proved to be far more complex than they had initially believed. So that is a piece that we're still working through with them.
Thank you. In your response to my colleague, Madame Debienne, you had mentioned that some of the 20% who did not respond to the survey were not active harvesters. What percentage are not active?
I didn't necessarily say non-active. Sorry, I said 77% only hold one license, and 18% only hold 2 to 3 licenses. I don't have the breakdown in terms of which of those single license or 2-3 license holders would be holding non-active fisheries.
Okay, what I'm trying to understand is of the 20% that didn't respond, do we know any information on that 20%?
We are able to, so 79% of license holders responded, 88% of licenses we have information on. So ultimately, it's only 12% of licenses where we're having insufficient information through the survey, but we still have line of sight on those through our own systems, and we'll be doing follow-up on a case-by-case basis.
And what will that follow-up look like?
That'll be sort of subject to what we find in our own sort of databases in terms of holdings, and once we have a better sense of the total quota that is associated with those licenses, the 88% of licenses that we have information on, because that'll further narrow the gap in terms of what is in play.
Have you been hearing through the chair any concerns from fish harvesters around the lack of accountability of those who have not responded to the survey, and those that haven't responded, that there may be some vital and key information not made available in the survey?
I am privy to those sort of concerns being expressed both to this committee and to ourselves at the departmental level.
Thank you. And so how will this be navigated once the results are being presented around the survey?
I mean, again, the survey was meant to inform and establish a baseline understanding of information. I think we are in a markedly improved posture with regards to understanding what is transpiring on the water. But case by case, we will be doing follow-up with license holders who elected to not respond to the survey.
Thank you. Any thoughts around the fact that when the survey was sent out that there was more of an incentive to not respond to the survey, even though it was listed as mandatory, than it was to respond to the survey? In hindsight, would there have been any changes to the process that would have further incentivized harvesters to respond and fishers to respond to the survey?
I'm stumbling perhaps a little bit with the notion of incentivizing response. I don't think we could have done anything further to incentivize response. We probably could have taken a more proactive communications posture with regards to this and reached out more assertively to license holders and fisheries associations and the like.
We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming here today. My question is to Mr. Waddell, I guess. Mr. Waddell, what would you say is more important to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans? Implementing marine protected areas to meet the government's commitment to its 30 by 30 arrangement with the United Nations, or addressing recommendations from reports like the one we're talking about here in 2019?
I think the Minister's mandate letter has outlined a number of priorities for our department, which we are all dutifully working to advance.
So I heard Mr. Let me see here, the gentleman on the screen. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, I heard you say to Mr. Hardy that DFO has 2 employees evaluating the recommendations of the 2019 study. Of the 5,000 new employees that the department has hired since 2015, how many are working on a marine mammal protection file? The marine protected area files, versus how many are working on looking at the recommendations of reports coming out of this committee?
Maybe I can offer just a different summary of my comments to Mr. Hardy, which is that while there are several staff who are dedicated to this file, there are quite a number of others who will have contributions to make to their pieces of it. They manage particular species, et cetera, and therefore have the expertise. So I think in the work we've done to date, and in the work we expect to do moving forward, there will be a much larger number of staff who are implicated or involved in the work on this file. Similarly, we have staff that are dedicated to working on advancing our various marine conservation target commitments, and then a larger number who are in other teams with primary responsibilities, say around managing fisheries, who make contributions to our advancing of that file.
Mr. Davis, why is this taking so long? Why, like you just indicated, that your department's going to ramp up its work as it relates to this 2019 study. This is 2023. A lot of livelihoods have been affected adversely in the fishing industry as a result of the lack of commitment that's been shown to the recommendations that have come out of that report. Why has this taken 4 years for now some indication that the department's going to ramp up its commitment to this report?
So I think, as I was describing earlier, we knew very early on that these are very wide-ranging recommendations. Some that we could do work on immediately, others that we would have to sort of prepare a foundation for to be able to advance work. And so that's what we've done. We've staged our work to advance the recommendations where we saw an opportunity and had the resources to do so. And then in other cases have been preparing the ground with some of that early outreach to identify, what the diversity of views are, what some of the key considerations are, and to gather some of that foundational information that could support an informed discussion or informed engagement around the issues and therefore what the options are to address them. So I think this is sort of much along the lines of what we expected to do. And we'll take, as you say, subsequent steps to do more in-depth engagement on some of the other recommendations where we've been moving that foundational work.
Okay, Mr. Chair, one more question for Mr. Davis. What pushback have you had from people that, are accused of participating in corporate concentration or that may be connected to foreign ownership? Have you had any pushback on the recommendations that have come out of this report? Would you mind explaining if you have, or perhaps if we don't have time, you can provide that in writing to the committee?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. I think what we know and have heard is a diversity of views. So we know there are some groups, individuals, organizations who very much support the committee's recommendations from the 2019 report. And we know there are a number of organizations, individuals who have expressed concerns about the implications of the committee's report. And I mean, those might be for a variety of reasons, but I would say some of the key concerns that I have heard have to do with some version of unscrambling the omelet. So, for decades now, we have operated and managed fisheries under a certain sort of regime where we have not set out specific constraints or limitations on things like who can hold a license or constraints. Well, there are some constraints, but constraints about that might be in place to achieve socioeconomic objectives around how quota might move between licenses. And so with some of the history on how fisheries have been managed in that respect, there are all kinds of arrangements in place. And so for us to make significant change, I think people who are participants now are asking hard questions or expressing concern about what that may mean for how it changes their own participation in the fishery. So for example, if they are, say, partners in the holding of a license and its associated quota, but we were to implement changes like this committee has recommended for something like owner-operator, how would they unwind that? Or in other cases where we have said there is too much capacity in fishery A and that fishery needs to rationalize, either through things like the introduction of transferable quota, which allows quota to move between licenses, and can and has created inactive harvesters who have moved their quota to another license that is actively fished. Things like that, if we were to implement requirements for how a license is fished, how do those things unwind, and what does it mean for those who have been a part of those arrangements? I think those are some of the most common kinds of questions that I've heard about the implications of some of the committee's recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Small. You're going way over time. I'll have to get that back from you somewhere along the way. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, my questions will be to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, you made a statement earlier about the department was working on grounding the truth from assertions. Could you elaborate for the committee what assertions have been made in the committee that the department does not feel was truthful?
So I don't know that I would suggest any of them haven't been truthful, just to clarify on that point. But I think what we've heard is a lot of concern from folks who have participated in these hearings in the past or directly to the department through our advisory processes, et cetera, about some of these dynamics regarding things like foreign ownership and corporate concentration. This committee has been looking at that issue as well recently, I know. And I think what we have been trying to do is bring the data to that to the extent that we can, recognizing that historically we have not collected a lot of that data. So trying to build on what information and details we have to generate a more complete or comprehensive picture, which we think will be helpful to pointing us at what the key issues are and also what the sort of viable solutions to those may be.
I'm not sure we landed on the same spot there. You also referenced the department would require further engagement. And again, could you expand on what further engagement and explain to the department what that process would undertake as it relates to, because the focus of this committee is on foreign ownership and the lack of control from the independent harvester. Could you briefly explain to the committee what that engagement process looks like in the department?
Sure. So I think looking back to the 2019 report, the recommendations were quite broad. So they did address the topics you covered, as well as a number of others that go beyond the context of foreign ownership and have implications, economic implications for participants in the fishery. Therefore, I think we are conscious that before sort of taking steps to make changes, we would want to comprehensively collect the views and input of those who may be affected by any changes we make, to be informed by their input. We are also conscious of the fact that First Nations are significant participants in commercial fisheries. We have commitments to them. We have a priority placed on reconciliation and want to ensure that we are also leaving enough space to engage with them.
Mr. Chair, to Mr. Davies, what has the department determined as being doable? Is there anything from the 2019 report, anything that we've heard to this date, that you would define as doable or actionable?
Yes, I think there are a number of things, and those are some of the things that we've acted on over the past several years. So that includes work we've done to look at.
Mr. Davis, could you provide to the committee in writing what you have actioned over the past year since 2019 as it relates directly to those recommendations, or even if it wasn't in the recommendation, anything that you have actioned that would address the issue that we've been hearing about constantly as it relates to corporate concentration, ownership, and foreign ownership? If you could, I would appreciate that.
Yes, we could provide a summary. Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. And my next question, either to you, Mr. Davies, or to Mr. Chair, to Mr. Waddell, is there any practices that you feel could be transferred from the East Coast to the West Coast as it relates to the different issues we've been hearing about at this committee now over 2 studies? We hear a lot of presenters appear before the committee and point to reference the East Coast as the laudable objective as where the West Coast should be going. And we know it's complex and you cannot unravel it. Numerous people have referred to unscrambling the omelet. But what practices from the East Coast, from your position within the ministry, do you think would be easily adaptable to the West Coast situation as a starting point?
I will offer a couple thoughts on that, and then Mr. Waddell may wish to add. I think, as you say, there have been a number of individuals and organizations who have identified the examples on the East Coast as things that the West Coast should implement, owner-operator fleet separation being the 2 most commonly cited examples. I think we, in our initial assessments, have looked at those and recognized that to take those steps would not be very simple. And it's for the reasons that you identified, in that there are these sort of existing arrangements that we would need to take account for. So I think those are the most commonly cited examples, and the ones that seem most, I think most important, or among the most important to a number of people who are looking for change. I think our initial assessment is that that may be possible, but it would be complicated, and that we'd be making significant changes to the management approach that's been in place for some time. But I'll invite my colleague to add if he wishes.
Anything to add? Could we get it in writing? Because Mr. Morrissey has gone way over his time, and I want to get to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier, you said that the minister has some discretionary power. There's reference to East as opposed to the West, and I can confirm that what is happening in the West is happening in the East. We've had witnesses appear before us who have said their families have always been fishers. They have been owners of quota boats, have lost everything. So there seems to be stratagems in place to, make it such that fishers are losing their licenses. There's not much time to stop this trend. What tools does the department have to be able to put a stop to this? There is an urgency. I would like to hear you, or I would like to see you go into greater depth about how the minister might be able to move quickly on some of the crying problems, such as families losing their livelihoods.
Thank you for the question. I think in terms of the tools available, there have been, you can see different approaches that have been taken on the East Coast, and I'm not the expert on that, but I will just quickly identify that there are some instances where limitations have been placed on foreign ownership. There have been regulatory solutions implemented to advance the owner-operator interests and the inshore regulations on the East Coast. So I think there are a variety of policy and regulatory tools that we can use to advance the minister's agenda or the department's agenda on these that we have at our disposal and that we have some experience with. But again, would invite my colleague, Mr. Waddell, to add.
If I might, the only thing I'd build on that response to indicate that in all instances where we have stood up those policy or regulatory tools, we've done so in concert with or through consultation with our Indigenous partners and industry itself. So there is, the immediate sort of toolkit, it does sort of run into the practical reality of our need to engage and get consultative feedback from our partners.
Bien, we're going a little bit over. We'll now go to Ms. Byrne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I forgot to do the timer, so I'll just trust you to cut me off. Thank you. I wanted to ask Mr. Davis specifically, there were some questions asked today about staffing numbers, and curious if you can share with us what an ideal staffing composition would look like to be able to see this moving forward in a more timely manner.
I think the key is for us to be able to draw on the expertise and time of a variety of existing staff within the department. The reality is that we need expertise in things like licensing and in our management approaches, which vary from one fishery to the next. So we essentially need to be able to draw on the expertise as we move ahead. And so it's a matter of work planning and ensuring that we plan ahead to have the time we need from those who have the expertise to contribute to this. And then we have that sort of coordinating and leading function happening with the dedicated staff on this file.
And so, Mr. Davis, through the chair, do you feel that that's been happening to date? That the staff have been fully utilized to their best capacity to be able to contribute to this work in a timely manner?
Well, I mean, as my colleague mentioned, we have the minister's mandate letter, which sets out a set of priorities for us, and a number of those staff that I mentioned, their contributions are sought on a variety of the department's priorities as set out in that mandate letter. So it will always be a balancing act. It will always be a matter of trying to support a number of the priorities that have been identified for the department to move different files forward. So I think that will remain the challenge as we move ahead.
Oh, 30 seconds, great. My last question to you, Mr. Davis, is around why such a different approach being taken on the east versus the west? We have seen that we can look at an approach that ensures that there's boots on the boats, and the profits going back to local communities, although there's clearly some issues relating to the processes being taken on the east coast. They're clearly seeing the advantages going to local fishers on the east at a larger extent to what we're seeing on the west. Why such a different approach? And I think I've already taken up my 30 seconds, so perhaps you can submit that in a written response.
Okay, thank you for that, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for coming. I think the first couple of questions perhaps might go to Mr. Davies, but feel free, whoever is the right person, because I'm not quite sure who the right person is on this one. Mr. Davis, the Gardner-Penfold study that was done, I think it was completed in 2021, was 2 years after this committee's report on corporate ownership and foreign ownership. Is that right?
It was issued in early 2021.
Years. So in it, if I read it correctly, it actually does recommend an Atlantic-style restructuring of the BC owner-operator and fleet separation policies. Am I reading that correct?
I might slightly edit that to say that we asked the contractor what would it take if we were to implement those East Coast policies in a West Coast context, and the contractor provided advice on that question.
Okay. Well, I'm aware that that's what you asked. I did think I saw a line towards the conclusion that said it would be of value, and it outlined a process to get there, or at least to do the consultation and some of the pitfalls learned from various things done. So if I understand you correctly, right now we're in the what Gardner-Penfold would call the what we heard phase, the consultation to produce a report on by DFO on what the various stakeholders think, and they called it the what we heard stage. Is that correct?
I think we have more engagement to do. And I think out of some more in-depth engagement, we will be better placed to do something like generate a well-informed what we heard report.
So you're going to do consultation to hear what your consultation should be, to put a report to say what we hear, and then the Gardner-Penfold study outlines there's a stage after that, that's when you put out a second report saying this is what we think we should do. So is that what I'm hearing the process is, that you're doing a consultation on what the consultation should be?
No, that's not what I intended. So we have done early consultation. We have a general understanding of some interests and views, but to really dig in to talk about what would it take if we were to implement the kinds of changes proposed, I think that warrants further consultation because of the significance of the implications of making those changes. I expect that out of that process would come some summary of this is what we heard and advice that the department would generate for the minister to consider about, what kinds of changes could respond to the issues that have been raised. What does that mean in the context of what we've heard from the people who are a part of the commercial fishery, so that she has the benefit of both input from all interested parties and the department's analysis to support any kinds of decisions.
And then would you go directly to policy recommendations to take through the system, or would you put out a paper saying, this is where we think we should go and let's do a consultation on that before you actually take policy to cabinet?
I think we'll sort of see how this next stage goes. For example, if we get very diverse views and no convergence on sort of major policy ideas, that may warrant, a subsequent step to try and bridge. If there's a lot of support for certain ideas, that may make it much easier for something the minister could decide to advance. So
It's taken us 4 years. It's taken us 4 years to get to this point. How much longer will that next phase take?
I think we plan to get engagement underway on this in the details in the coming months, and I think we have an interest in making that process efficient, so that we actually have some next steps or some ideas proposed. The
aquaculture consultation was less than 6 months. So are you proposing something like that or longer?
This is a much broader set of recommendations than that have implications for a variety of dimensions in the fishery. So I don't think we're anticipating we can get through all of this in 6 months, but I do think we want to be efficient. And so trying to get through that in, say, a year or so is probably a more reasonable time frame, but we'll finalize that once we have some additional direction. It doesn't preclude us from getting underway, though.
Right on time. That's probably a first for anyone around this table. We'll now go to Mr. Callaway, but I think Mr. Callaway has conceded his time to Mr. Hardy for 5 minutes or less, please.
My goodness, I owe a shipment of smoked salmon from the coast to everybody who's been so generous over the last few meetings, except for Ms. Barron, who has her own source, I'm sure. Okay. We have the picture of trying to move a whole industry on the West Coast to a new model, which is like trying to, move a skyscraper a couple of blocks down the block. Is it not possible to take more of a modular approach to this? For instance, and I'll ask, maybe Mr. Waddell might be the best to answer this, but Mr. Davis, if you will, you can. Is it possible tomorrow to say there will be no further sales or transfer of licenses or quota to non-Canadians?
I won't speculate on the tomorrow, but I do agree with the concept that it is modular. We are capable of moving in a modular fashion. And again, on the foreign ownership piece, I think that is a piece where, frankly, we could move in a more nimble fashion, recognizing the completion of the survey, that we have policies already in application on the East Coast and Atlantic Canada. We could have an informed discussion with West Coast license holders as to what level of foreign ownership they would deem to be appropriate, and we could establish that bar.
So that would also, of course, have to entail knowing who the beneficial owners were, we understand that the survey that the DFO put out was somewhat flawed because it really didn't ask the right question the right way. What about ensuring that any license renewal must include information on the beneficial ownership of whoever is renewing the license?
Again, that could be a decision that the minister could elect to pursue, subsequent to discussion and consultation with stakeholders.
Why would it have to be subject to that?
I think just reflecting on the survey itself and setting aside the concepts or the discrepancies that people have highlighted with regards to the survey and how it was undertaken, there was still a commitment made by the department that we would return and have an informed discussion with parties as to the findings of that survey. I don't necessarily see that taking a large extent of time if we wished it, but there is that commitment, and I think we would seek to adhere to that commitment.
Well, I think reflecting Mr. Perkins' questioning, it looks like we're always at risk of analysis paralysis here. You know, that in fact maybe brave decisions can be taken with almost immediate effect that will move us along to what the very, very broad consensus on the coast is. That is to, you know, start the first steps of getting foreign ownership out of licenses and quota. I'll just leave that as a comment. You don't need to react to that. Now, again, instead of moving the whole industry to an owner-operator fleet separation, the suggestion has been made by one stakeholder that I've heard from, that we could start small. What about a First Nation owner-operator model, where, in fact, when a First Nation community is given a license, it has to be fished by somebody with boots on the deck from that community? Could that be made to stick?
I can offer a response to that. I think, strictly speaking, it could be implemented. I think there are important questions we would want to explore with our Indigenous partners about their interests. I know that right now, the communal commercial licenses are used in different ways. So in some instances, they are actively fished. In other instances, the community has decided it's in their best interest to, for example, lease the quota on that license for it to be fished elsewhere in order to generate economic revenue to support what the community's priorities are. So I think that would need to be something to explore with them.
That point I agree, although, and it is a sensitive area. Mr. Davis, you mentioned that there are conflicting interests and views that your work has uncovered so far. Can you, in the time remaining, go into a bit more detail? What do those conflicts look like?
Right. Thank you for the question. So I think the key examples that I hear most often have to do with this phrase we've used before of unscrambling the omelet. There are arrangements that have been in place for some time, and that some of the proposals for change, fleet separation or owner-operator, what would they mean for unwinding some of those arrangements? There are, as I think this committee is aware, instances where processors hold licenses, and there are instances where we have a variety of arrangements in terms of who holds licenses and quota, large corporate entities and otherwise. And so I think it's really that. What are the implications and what kinds of disruption may result from making these kinds of changes? That I think is the most common source of concern that I hear about some of these proposals.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start off with, I guess, Mr. Davis, but maybe if someone else has the answer, that would be fine as well. At our June 1st meeting, officials from Foreign Affairs were asked who in their department was focused on protecting Canadian fisheries from too much or inappropriate foreign investments or corporate concentration that resemble a cartel. Foreign Affairs officials deferred that question to, quote, the experts at DFO. What branch of DFO contains the experts in protecting our fisheries from cartels or laundering of money from overseas?
So I'll begin, and then I will invite my colleague, Mr. Waddell, to add. As I mentioned, on the Pacific Coast, historically, we have not had constraints in place that would limit the participation of corporations or foreign interests in the holdings of commercial licenses. There are two kinds of licenses on the West Coast. There are party-based licenses and vessel-based licenses. So in vessel-based licenses, the department issues a license to a vessel. It assigns the license to a vessel. Transport Canada is the primary regulatory authority for
it's your
overseeing
department
who holds the vessel.
Is it your department that's responsible for this then? Which department
I think,
is responsible?
I think in the context of these two license types, there would be potentially multiple regulatory authorities implicated.
Within DFO?
No, DFO and Transport Canada, who has the primary regulatory authority over vessels.
But Transport Canada has no regulatory authority over licenses and quotas, which is really what the problem is. I'm surprised that after this much time, the department is still having trouble wrapping its head around what the real sources of the problems are here. Have you read Peter German's 2019 report produced for the Attorney General of BC entitled Dirty Money Part 2?
I've only read small sections of it that were relevant to fisheries and sort of received very short briefings on some of its key findings.
Do you know if the minister has read or been briefed on this report?
I don't know.
So this report contains details of how foreign money is used in a targeted fashion in BC's fisheries, and it's relevant. So I'm surprised that you're not even aware, especially if this is your realm, not even aware if the minister is aware. Previously, you mentioned that the minister retains the decision-making power to decide when or where licenses or quotas are issued. What criteria related to foreign ownership or corporate concentration would factor into not issuing a license and quota? I'm asking you to be quite specific.
Well, as I mentioned, we don't currently have limitations on corporate concentration or foreign ownership in Pacific fisheries, so we do not apply criteria to assess that.
So the minister doesn't retain decision-making authority over issuing those licenses and quota, contrary to what was stated earlier.
I wouldn't characterize it that way. I think it's more accurate to say that we have a current management approach that we implement, which does not entail those constraints on who holds licenses or quota. If we were to choose a management approach that had those constraints, then yes, I expect we would have to develop some kind of approach or assessment that allowed us to validate who was participating.
I'm shocked that after this many years of British Columbia harvesters raising the alarm bells on this, that the department is so slow to react and has such a poor grasp of the actual problem to start addressing it. Earlier, you mentioned that you're doing staged work to move quickly where possible. Recommendation 2 of the report was that based on the principle that fish in Canadian waters are a resource for Canadians, for example, i.e. a common property, no future sales of fishing quota and licenses to be to non-Canadian beneficial owners based on the consideration of issues of legal authority and international agreement trade impacts. Why, or has any action been taken on recommendation number 2? And if so, why not?
I'll invite my colleague, Mr. Waddell, to respond to that.
So thank you for the question, Chair. This is exactly why we pursued the beneficial ownership survey. But in advance and in recognizing that recommendation from this committee, we extended the application of that recommendation nationally and sought to do a review of the department's portfolio of foreign ownership policies. The inshore license holders in Atlantic Canada are, of course, subject to 100% Canadian ownership. The offshore and midshore fleets in Atlantic Canada had a 51% Canadian ownership requirement in policy, which we updated and extended to the entire corporate chain. So no longer just the first license holder, but the entire corporate structure that supports that above, ensuring that there's 51% Canadian ownership. And where we had not historically had a policy in Pacific, that's why we undertook the survey to get a better factual lay of the land.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hanley for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you to all of you for appearing today. First, I just wanted to go back to the recommendation 5, which was on prioritizing the collection of socioeconomic data for past and future regulatory changes. Mr. Davis, in this recent study, socioeconomic concerns have certainly been a common subject, and how socioeconomic benefits are interpreted by different stakeholders, including between, say, the fishing community and DFO. I wondered if you could expand on how you're responding to this recommendation and how you anticipate socioeconomic considerations will be incorporated along with conservation objectives into regulatory changes.
Certainly. So, and thank you for the question. So, as you alluded to, one of the things we're doing is attempting to collect better information about the socioeconomics of the fishery. So, if you'll permit me, there are a few pieces here. It may take me a minute or two to get through them, but this has been an area where we have done a fair bit of work. So, there's been several socioeconomic surveys that have been initiated. The first is to implement a reoccurring cost and earnings survey. So this is collecting information that will allow us to better ascertain where the direct benefits of commercial fisheries accrue, to understand things like coastal community reliance on fisheries. This was conducted in November of 2022. We're now completing the analysis of that data and expect to be engaging with industry about it in the months ahead, and also talking about how frequently we want to recollect that data. So that's the first piece. The second piece that we are doing work on is something called an annual price survey to improve price accuracy and to fill some gaps in where we had price data. We shared some plans for the design of this survey with commercial fishery stakeholders in the fall, and expect to be implementing the survey later in 2023, and then sharing those results and talking about their implications. The next piece I want to mention quickly is the commercial support services study. And this is to provide an overview of commercial fishing support sectors, so things like fuel services, gear, vessel repairs, supplies, moorage, to get a better picture of, what's the community reliance on fishing activities in different places. And so we've contracted some work to estimate revenues from commercial harvest to support those sector businesses for 9 different regions of the province. So these are examples of different ways that we're trying to collect more information that will actually sort of provide a basis for making decisions that would reflect what we understand about the reliance on commercial fisheries. I think the other piece is then sort of how do we structure policy or regulatory frameworks to reflect socioeconomic considerations, and that is something I expect to come out of the engagement we have planned for more in-depth sort of review of some of the committee's recommendations. And we do have some examples in other parts of the country that we've been alluding to this morning, which could give us some places to work from.
Thank you. I'm going to, since I only have about a minute left, I'm just going to jump to another question, which is slightly off subject, but taking advantage of your presence as regional director for BC and Yukon. And last week I met with the salmon subcommittee in the Yukon. They were meeting in Dawson City. I was zooming in, and there were two key questions from them. One was about overall capacity for them as an organization to address this complex and critical area of Yukon salmon populations. But also the other one was about funding from the PSSI, which still apparently has not worked its way into support the committee or other work in the Yukon. So I wonder if you can comment whether you have sufficient staff capacity to ensure that Yukon's priorities as part of the West Coast ecosystem is being adequately addressed, as well as perhaps comment on PSSI funding for the Yukon.
Certainly. So you're right that or I should mention or be clear that the PSSI funding can support salmon restoration, rebuilding, et cetera, in both BC and the Yukon. I know that we have just gone through a round of reviewing project proposals that could support Indigenous transformation, which I think would be particularly relevant in the Yukon, and expect to be communicating with those who have submitted proposals about what kind of funding is available this year. I also know that we have work underway related to assessing what it would take to advance a review of the salmon allocation policy in a Yukon context. So those are just a couple examples of places where we are doing work to address matters that are relevant to the Yukon context. And I also know that we have staff that are dedicated to working on the PSSI file in the Yukon. So I think we have the pieces in place, and it's just a matter of moving those forward in a way that brings others along with us and responds to some of the priorities that are identified.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Davis or Mr. Waddell, how can you be sure that the survey responses are truthful?
I'll invite my colleague to respond to that.
Thank you. So to validate the responses, we provided all of that information to the forensic auditors over at Public Works, or PSPC, who are able to use a multitude of public source information to cross-reference and validate the survey results, identify inaccuracies or things that seem unusual to them as experts, and then provide that information back to us. We're, in turn, linking that information, those findings, with our own quota databases to determine who holds what extent of quota for various fisheries. So there's a variety of ways we can cross-check, and where there have been discrepancies, we have sought to do follow-up questions with the respondents.
Est-ce que vous avez eu beaucoup
Have there been many discrepancies?
There were certainly a number of touch points over the course of the survey submission window when it was open for respondents to submit their information, where they sought additional insight from us as to the nature of the questions, what we were seeking to have provided. And we did a lot of work with license holders to help them respond. At this point in time, though, I'm not certain as to the extent of cases that have been specifically identified by the forensic auditors that we have started follow-up on.
Est-ce que quelqu'un d'entre vous peut...
Could any one of you explain why some who have come to testify before us wanted to remain anonymous?
I think that would be a matter, Mr. Chair, of speculation on my part. But it's probably pursuant to their own particular business arrangements that they may feel may be at risk by them taking a proactive stance on certain facets of those arrangements.
Is right on time. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I need to use the 2.5 minutes wisely here. I just wanted to follow up, Mr. Waddell. I know I'm spending a lot of my time focused on the survey, but it is a key component of the work that we're doing. And my frustration is that when you're describing the process of how the survey was constructed, you identified that one of the pieces to have the lightest administrative tasks associated with it. if we want to actually move forward with a survey that is accurate and useful, would that not be the number one focus, is to ensure that accurate, up-to-date information is being accumulated, regardless of how that looks, to ensure that you can move forward with that information and implement the strategies required to ensure that local communities and local fishers are seeing the benefits of our public resource in fisheries?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We do still feel that the survey results will be accurate. They're certainly statistically relevant. And in conjunction with the information that our forensic audit colleagues are able to provide and glean from publicly available sources, business registries and the like, from not just domestic, but of foreign interest as well, it provides us a common information base that will allow us to have an informed public discussion.
1 minute? Okay, wasn't sure if that was a stop or 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, I guess the most important next question I'm going to ask is around, we heard from many Indigenous fishers around the process, the pick fee licenses, and some of the problems with the licensing system, and that Indigenous people are seeing they're losing their livelihoods, traditional knowledge. What work is being done specifically to work alongside in partnership with First Nations to ensure that those benefits of their connection with the fisheries time immemorial is not being lost?
Thank you for the question. I maybe can offer a response. I think there's a few maybe main themes I would mention. The first is that we do have a team within the region who work specifically with the pick fee program to support First Nations and the way those licenses are administered and delivered, et cetera. So I think that's an important source of sort of very operational support that is worth mentioning. More broadly, though, we hear very consistently about the importance of fisheries to many First Nations communities and have relationships developed or developing with them in a variety of contexts. There's an operational relationship or a program level relationship that relates to how we deliver fisheries access, and we have staff that are point people for relationships with individual communities. In a number of instances, we also have reconciliation agreements that are being negotiated with First Nations that set out a longer term vision for how they would like to participate in the kind of relationship they want with the department, and or treaty related negotiations that are doing very similar things. So those are a few of the ways that the department is trying to sort of build those relationships and support First Nations aspirations for participation.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Waddell, I just want to explore a little bit in the next few minutes the beneficial ownership survey. And for those who are watching or on internet, or some people tend to do anyway, just so folks understand that what that means is who ultimately benefits from the ownership of the license, who owns the license, and then who benefits from that. And because presumably in British Columbia, a number of the corporations that own these are numbered or unidentifiable companies, you have to sort of trace back through a complex corporate web as to who might ultimately be the beneficial owner. Is that correct?
That is correct. The purpose of the beneficial ownership survey was to identify the natural persons, the humans, at the very end of those flow of benefits.
So it's fair to say that until that work's completed, I believe that began, according to the Mr. Davies' speaking notes, about 17 months ago. Until that work is completed, it's fair to say that DFO actually doesn't know who the beneficial owner of any fishing licenses on the West Coast.
We know who the title holder is in terms of who holds that license, who's on record as holding that license, but in terms of the beneficial flow of benefits derived from the license, you are correct.
That would be like a numbered company or something like that. You would know what the numbered company was, or perhaps a named company, but not the corporate structure that leads to the ownership.
Correct, and it's through the beneficial ownership survey that we're getting back to those natural persons.
So to to that point, we've heard testimony that said, and I think it's been referenced earlier, but I'll try and be perhaps a little more specific, that the survey said that it was directed to license holders and not to license owners. So is that a legitimate distinction? In other words, the person who holds the license could be somebody leasing it because licenses are leased and they hold it and are fishing it. They're not actually the ultimate owner. So did the survey go to the company that may have been leasing it or holding it rather than the actual owner?
So just for the benefit of all, I guess, including myself, the Crown would view to retain the ownership of all licenses. The Crown is ultimately the owner. So all parties are holders of licenses, not owners of licenses. But to your question, Mr. Chair, yes, the question would have flowed to the holder of the license. And in the subset of questions that were also provided as part of the survey, they would be seeking to identify if they had arrangements in place that would see beneficial ownership or benefits derived from said license flow to other parties. So that gets to the lease arrangements.
How would you ask that question? So in the case of a leaseholder, the leaseholder would share with you the corporate entity name that they were leasing or fishing it for, but they probably or may not know anything beyond who owns that entity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the interest of time, perhaps what I would suggest is that we provide this committee with the survey itself and the questions therein, such that you can see what we asked.
That would be great. Thank you. We've had, in the study that we've got ongoing now, a claim made in one of the written presentations that the Pattison Group, through several corporate entities, owns about 50% of all the licenses in British Columbia. Do you know whether that's true or not? And I'll come back to my next question after that. Sorry.
I am familiar with other pieces of work that certainly have provided that similar indication. The results for our own survey we're anticipating in the matter of next few days and getting back out to stakeholders and making it publicly available within the next couple of weeks. So we'll determine through our own survey if that's further validation of that perspective.
TFO has policies on corporate concentration in particular fisheries in particular areas, does it not, on trying to ensure that monopolistic practices aren't held. So, for example, the Competition Bureau looks at 30% or more, basically, of any industry being owned by one single corporate entity being an issue.
Thank you for the question. And here I would draw upon my regional colleague. We do, in fact, have corporate concentration limits in terms of the number of licenses that can be held by a party or the extent of quota that can be held by a party, detailed within the integrated fisheries management plans on a fishery-by-fishery basis in Pacific region and elsewhere in the country.
We'll now go to
Yes,
Mr. Cormier
that is
for 5 minutes or less, please.
Mr. Chair, actually, I'm giving my time to my colleague, Mr. Hardy. So.
Well, he's going to owe a lot of people smoked salmon.
Yeah, no, it's getting onerous, Mr. Chair. I wonder, Mr. Waddell or Mr. Davis, are you aware of Bill C-42, which is going to amend the Canada Business Corporations Act, that will basically require the beneficial ownership in Canadian corporations to be identified?
Thank you for the question. I am aware of that requirement and that being a priority of the government to bring that in.
Now, given that our fishery is basically a common resource and is federally regulated, would it be fair to say that anybody from offshore who comes in to buy licenses or quota would fall under this federal framework ultimately?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Business holders, license holders can elect to either register their corporation at a federal level or at a provincial level. So there would be provincial jurisdiction that could apply here. Equally, they do not have to register as a corporate entity. They do so typically for tax purposes and the benefits that are derived, but they don't have to register as a corporation.
And I would presume that even the amendments to the Canada Business Corporations Act wouldn't necessarily cover an individual from offshore who comes in and just with his own funds in partnership with nobody else buys licenses or quota.
I am racking my brain as to the extent of knowledge I hold on C-42, which is not sufficient to address the question that you're putting to me, I'm afraid.
That then sort of begs the question, are you going to become familiar with C-42? And would the DFO, in light of the recommendations that came out of the 2019 report and in light of the conversation we've had today, would you be prepared to wade into committee study or debates, or through us, debates on C-42 to see if it can or needs amendments to be more effective?
To my understanding, Mr. Chair, the preponderance of corporations that are found within all fisheries nationally are in turn registered with their provincial area of jurisdictions. They'd be registered under provincial law. There has been a heightened effort across the country with a number of jurisdictions undertaking work on beneficial ownership and establishing or seeking to establish beneficial ownership registries akin to what is pursued through C-42.
Going back, I mentioned earlier that the fishers at two community meetings basically tagged their priorities for action out of the 20 recommendations. I want to draw your attention to recommendation number 3, which I believe was referenced earlier, that Fisheries and Oceans Canada permit the separation of stacked or married licenses for sale by the license owner. At the time, we were told that this was low-hanging fruit. This could be done. Has it been done? Or if it hasn't been done, why not, and when will it happen?
I can take that question, and thank you for the question through the chair. So this is something that the department has attempted to do in several fisheries in the past. And the reason for that is that we have changed our management approaches and don't necessarily need restrictions on stacking or marriage, or for that matter, vessel length, like we, for the purposes that we used them in the past. What we have encountered in trying to make those changes is very sort of divided views within among fishery participants in terms of support for those changes. The reason being that people may have invested and sort of benefited from those restrictions or have spent money to acquire a license based on something like its vessel length or the other licenses that it has married with, licenses it has married with it. So we have made attempts, have encountered, fairly divided views on this. And in the face of those divided views, have not to date taken steps to remove those. I think the department's view remains that there are a number of instances where those could be removed without compromising the conservation performance of the fishery. So we are interested in pursuing those.
It would come down to a matter of
time, sir. You're not.
First time today. I'm sure.
Yeah, it's like you're immune to it. That concludes our rounds of questioning. I know we have a bit of time left, but I don't know what kind of time our officials have to spend with us. They've been here now for a little over an hour and a half. If they have got a little bit more time, I'd give everyone like a rapid-fire question for each side, or we'll adjourn, one or the other. Fine? All right. Okay, I want to say a big thank you, of course, to the departmental officials today for coming again and sharing their knowledge with the committee, to Mr. Davis, Mr. Waddell and Ms. Mooney. Again, thank you. You've made yourself available for probably longer than most people do here to the committee, and we want to say thank you for that, and hopefully we'll get to move something forward. Mr. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll thank the witnesses, but I would also like to mention that we've heard over the weekend of 4 deaths on the shore of a former colleague of ours, Marlene Gill. A former long-term member of this committee lost 4 individuals when the tide came in very quickly. So I'd like to pass on our thoughts to her and her community while we're here today.
Waters can be very dangerous at times, and we can never take it for granted. So again, Mr. Hardy.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think in light of the session that we've had today, and I do really appreciate the support of all of our colleagues here to make this particular session possible, with more hopefully to come in the future on other items that we've brought forward through studies. But with everybody's approval, I would like to move a motion that, based on what we've heard today, that a letter be sent to the minister outlining what we've heard, identifying the gaps, and suggesting action.
You've heard the intent of the motion. Do I see any discrepancies, Mr. Arnold?
I believe we've agreed that what we heard today would be part of the current report and a study and report that we're doing. Is that correct? So you're suggesting that we write a separate letter as well?
Yes, Mr. Arnold, because the current study involves corporate concentration and foreign ownership, but the scope of the 2019 report certainly went a lot further. That doesn't mean to say that we can't incorporate some of what we've heard in the current study, but there are other aspects of this, things that could be done sooner rather than later if the minister signals a very strong agenda that it be done. These are the sorts of things I think we could cover in a letter.
Everybody okay with Ms. Barron?
I'd be in support of that. And I only take the opportunity to say that so that I can say I would like to say something after we're finished this, before we conclude the meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm not hearing any dissension on that. We'll assume that's a unanimous decision that will be made and done. Something will be sent to the Minister on it. And again, thank you to our witnesses, and we'll now go into something that Ms. Barron has to bring up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We never have extra time, so I'm just going to take a quick opportunity just to bring to the committee's attention that I have put forward a motion for a study that is being translated. And so I just want to give notice that that's going to be going out to everybody for review. If we had unanimous consent, I'd be willing to talk about it now, but I'm also willing to wait the 48 hours as it normally takes.
I haven't seen it yet, I know.
Okay.
So other members probably haven't either, so it's probably better that we leave it for a couple of meetings or a meeting at least, to let everyone get it and decide if they're for or against, or think it's good, think it's bad. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Hearing nothing else, meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone.